All right, welcome everyone. I'm Russ Payne. I teach philosophy at Bellevue College, and I want to thank the Foley Institute for hosting this event, and Joe Campbell for helping me organize this event. When Joe and I were talking about back in the spring about who we should invite as a keynote speaker, Bill Talbott was the first name that came to my mind, and I think it was fairly easy to convince Joe that this was a good idea. I've known Bill for about 10 years or so, and he's done some notable work on human rights at UW, and I've had him up to Bellevue College to speak once or twice. I've always been very pleased with the sort of sunny, optimistic view he has of moral development, and we're going to see some of that today. It might be a little provocative for some of the pessimistic curmudgeons like myself, but I think it'll be a healthy elixir for our dark times in any case. So I'd like to welcome Bill Talbott.
Well, I want to thank Russ and Joe for inviting me, and also the Foley Institute for hosting this event. For those of us in this room who are old enough to remember when Tom Foley was Speaker of the House of Representatives, all I can say is every year I miss him more and more. Okay, now, today, I'll try to be my optimistic self. Today I'm going to talk about the greatest show on earth. And of course the title came because last May, the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus announced that they were ending the greatest show on earth. And so I'm here to give you some good news. They ended their circus, but they haven't ended the greatest show on earth, at least not yet. And to understand why it's the greatest show on earth, I want to tell you a little bit about a South Park episode. In the South Park episode, Earth is actually a reality TV show. And it's popular all over the universe. And why is it popular all over the universe? Well, they had this great idea for a reality TV show. They would take one planet and they would put all these different ethnic and religious groups on the same planet. And so what they get is non-stop conflict, right? And if you look at the history of humanity, it really is sort of non-stop conflict. It's not all conflict every day, everywhere, but you can be pretty confident for all of recorded history, there has been conflict somewhere. Every day there's been conflict somewhere, right? So it's a really popular TV show throughout the universe, and you get lots of wars, lots of violent death, slavery, colonization, and other forms of oppression. This sells. This is really, if you just had, it's like what Tolstoy said, if you have a happy families are all happy in the same way. You can't write a novel about it, and you can't make a high-rated TV show about just people who are happy all the time. But get conflict, and you've got a high-rated. So we have one of the highest-rated shows in the universe, okay? But here's something that's happened in the course of that show, which is sort of surprising. What's happened is, in the course of all this history of conflict, there have been emergence of lots of things, but I'm going to focus on the emergence of human rights, ideas, and norms. And I'm going to talk about that today. And what I want to draw your attention to is that it's really surprising, because it's not surprising that there would be conflict. But what's surprising is that a right to religious freedom, say, would emerge. And if I say to you, oh, where did the right to religious freedom come from? You immediately say, well, the Western tradition. The Western tradition is a human rights tradition, right? So it came from the Western tradition. So then I ask you, is the Western tradition a tradition of religious tolerance? Let's take a vote. Get used to it. How many people say the Western tradition is a tradition of religious tolerance? I'm talking about tolerance. How many people say it's not a tradition of religious tolerance? Indeed, Zagoran, who wrote a whole book on religious tolerance, you know what he said? He said, the Christian tradition is the most intolerant tradition that ever existed. And so, see, it's a surprise. If there were some tradition of religious tolerance and they agreed on a right of religious freedom, that would not be a surprise. But if you take the most intolerant tradition and somehow or other they come to thinking there's a right, well, that's really interesting. I mean, if they think, why would you say that's just limited to the Western tradition? Of course it's not. As a matter of fact, before there was a Christian tradition, in the 3rd century BC, in India, the Emperor Ashoka, who is still revered as one of the great emperors, had a problem. And you know what the problem was? Sectarian strife, religious strife. And you know what his solution was? His solution was, we'll just allow all of them to practice their religion. And he's still to this day recognized for having such a peaceful and prosperous reign. So you see, you don't have to be in the Western tradition. You don't have to be in any particular tradition to be able to appreciate the value of a right. Nonetheless, it took thousands of years. It took thousands of years for that right to be developed. Okay, now I'm not going to go through all the rights, but I'm going to do a few. Just a right against genocide. Oh, look, at least there's a tradition of a right against genocide, right? What tradition? What tradition has a right against genocide? Oh, well, the Judeo-Christian tradition. Oh, man. I'm sorry to break your heart here. But genocide has been practiced and approved of for thousands of years, including in the Bible, the Old Testament. And I have a reference here to Joshua, which I won't read to you now, but it's God's commanding genocide. After the Battle of Jericho. And now, again, I'm not doing this to make fun of God. No. Sorry, I'm not doing that. What I'm doing is trying to show you that these ideas have emerged even though there's no tradition that started off endorsing them, right? Okay, let's do a couple more and then we're going to... Right not to be enslaved. Oh, okay. Now, tell me, there must be a tradition, some tradition, that has opposed slavery. Is there any tradition that opposes slavery? Well, not. Unless you get very technical with me, say, well, in the Hindu system, right, they had only the caste system. But, I mean, the untouchables are, that you have moral equivalent of slaves, right? Okay. Well, and then finally, rights against discrimination. And the reason that I mention rights against discrimination is because historically, every culture has not only norms of discrimination against outsiders, but every culture has norms that discriminate against women, right? And so, and if you remember, I was the Joff Hanauer Professor of Western Civilization. It's not because I think, the Western tradition is a human rights tradition, or the Western tradition is better than all the other traditions. No. Let's put our cards on the table. They're all equally bad. Okay? So once you do it that way, then relief. Okay, we're not worried that somehow or other he's going to tell us, that there's some, really the message is, no, what's interesting is what I want to talk about is humanity as a whole. That's what I want to talk about. And I want to talk about recognition of our humanity and how, painfully, it's really slow, right? We're talking about thousands of years here. We're going to recap, shortly we're going to recap thousands of years in about 5 minutes. But in any case, I want to recognize a certain kind of process which is not well understood. Okay, the list goes on. Why is it not well understood? Well, because most people think that moral ideas come from like the moral authorities or from the sacred moral texts, the sacred religious texts. But this history that I'm talking about is a history that didn't come from the moral authorities or the sacred texts, right? The sacred texts actually endorsed slavery. The Pope had slaves. So it didn't come that way. And I hope this is not a shock to anyone. It was not an articulation of self-evident truths. I mean, this is quite amazing. I mean, we could have an interesting discussion of why it did the authors of the Declaration of Independence say we hold these truths to be self-evident. And if we had that discussion, it very quickly would emerge and you would see, not even they regarded them as self-evident. But of course they weren't self-evident. What does self-evident mean? We have some philosophers here. They could sure tell me. Right? Yes?
That it's universal.
Yeah, but he's one of that. No rational person could disagree with it. It's so obviously true. I don't have to give you reasons for it or anything. You see, and it's in classical philosophy. It's where you had to start arguments from. That it was so obvious you didn't even have to give a reason for it. And so if we say, why did they say it? It was because they recognized that model and they knew they had to start somewhere. But look, where the idea is self-evident, well, as I say, you can... This document, so often nowadays we say, this document, and they point to a certain document, and they say it was revolutionary, right? The Declaration of Independence was literally revolutionary. Here's an example of a self-evident truth. 2 + 2 = 4. Would anybody go to war over the truth of that statement? If people are going to war over it, it is not self-evident. But of course we know it's not self-evident because at the time, most educated people in the world would have thought it was obviously false. That people were equal and they had certain equal rights. Are you kidding me? So anyway, it was not self-evident. So what was it? Now, what I'm going to do is I want to try to show you that it was a bottom-up, a largely bottom-up process of moral transformation. What do I mean by bottom-up? I mean bottom-up actually in 2 ways. But the main way is this. If you think of moral teachings that come from the authorities down to the people, that's top-down. When it goes the other direction, from the people, and maybe ultimately, eventually, the authorities catch on, that's bottom-up. Okay? And also, it's bottom-up in this way. It's judgments about particular cases, like this treatment of this person is wrong. It doesn't start from big generalizations, like everyone has a right to life, liberty, years. The generalizations come much later, but it's based on people on the ground making moral judgments about particular kinds of situations. That's the way the process actually works. And what's amazing, and this is what we're going to be talking about today, even after I tell you if that's how it works, there's still a question. How is it possible? How is it possible? Okay, here it is. Remember I said 5 minutes? This is just the early history of morality, and then I'll take 10 minutes for the longer history, okay? The early history of morality. And I'm going to do it starting from an evolutionary standpoint. From an evolutionary standpoint, what you have is you have really powerful selection pressures for groups. The reason we're social animals is because we can get the benefits of cooperation. And the benefits of cooperation in collective action problems are huge. And somebody says, how many people here know what a collective action problem is? Just interesting. So it's a very small percentage of the... Look, I do a lot of public service. Just to tell you a little bit about what collective action problems is so important, we have to take a minute here. We're going to take a break. What's a collective action problem? And in particular, I'm going to talk about what's called an in-person prisoner's dilemma. The name of it is terrible, but I didn't get to give it a name. But in any case, what I want you to do is I want you to see that there are lots of situations you can recognize as being collective action. And as a matter of fact, my point here is evolution has actually selected you for being able to recognize collective action problems and to be recognized what I'm going to call free riders. What's a collective action problem? Well, here, now, if you look over, this is a decision matrix. So it's only in the 20th century that we have game theory where we actually have these kinds of representations. But the idea that I'm calling a collective action problem was an important one in philosophy before that. And Thomas Hobbes actually built his whole political philosophy around it, okay, for those of you who read a little Hobbes. But the idea is, suppose we all live around a lake. We all live around a lake. And now here, they're recording me right now, so every time I walk away, people who are watching are going to be wincing a little bit. But I'm going to walk over, and they can see the slide, so I can talk about the slide. And what we have is a very general situation. We live around the lake, and I want to tell you the story. I was the first one to move to the lake. And when I moved there, it was such a beautiful lake, I called it Clear Lake. Then everybody else moved, and finally Brooke came over, and she was the last one to come in. And when she moved there, she said, Bill, I just have one question for you. Why do they call it Clear Lake? And you know why she did that? Because we'd all been dumping our garbage in the lake for all this time, you know? It was a stinking mess. Okay, it was a stinking mess. But when I named it, it was a Clear Lake. Okay, so here's what happened. We said, look, we recognize this. If we all paid to have our garbage and sewage hauled away, we could go back to when it was a beautiful lake, and the first number is for me. How desirable that is for me, 100. How desirable that is for everyone else, 100. It would be great. We would love it. Right? I mean, we could use the water for drinking. We could use the water for swimming. All these things that we can't. We don't even want to go outside of our house right now because it stinks so much, right? Yeah. And then I said to Brooke, but notice, because cooperating would be to pay to have our garbage hauled away. Defecting is to dump our garbage in the lake. And here's what's happened. Everybody's dumping their garbage in the lake. And so instead of being at 100, we all say we're at minus 100. It's really pretty bad. But here's the amazing thing. Brooke just got here, and she says, man, I wish we had a nice clean lake. But then at the end of the month, she has to decide, will I pay to have my garbage hauled away, or will I dump it in the lake? And here's what she knows. It's already a stinking mess. she might as well dump hers in the lake. Why should she? If she dumps it if she pays to have it hauled away, she's even worse off. She's minus 100 if she dumps it in the lake, but she has to pay. That's worse. So negative number worse, right? And really, we're all in that situation. For each one of us, we're saying, man, I sure would like to have a clear, but pie a little bit, it's not going to make a difference. So I might as well dump it, okay? Well, that kind of problem is a problem that, from an evolutionary point of view, if societies can solve it, it gives them a great advantage. Why? Pollution? Well, actually, pollution is just because there are so many other things that have this kind of structure. Laws against killing, stealing, polluting, as well as contract law, traffic law, tax collections. I could go on and on. Public goods. All of these things have this structure of collective action problems. And so as a result, evolution selected for groups that can solve their own collective action problems. And here's how you can tell how you were selected in that way. That human beings, when in a collective action problem, suppose we were all paying to have our garbage hauled away. And see, Brooke, I won't pick you for this one. Russ says, look, everybody else is paying to have their garbage hauled away. So if I dump my garbage in the lake, nobody will notice, right? So he dumps his garbage in the lake. He's a free rider. Here's the thing. People living around the lake, how are they going to feel if they catch Russ dumping his garbage in the lake? Are they going to say, oh, Russ, that's okay, because you're only one person? They're going to say, Russ is taking advantage of us. We're paying to have our garbage hauled away, and he's dumping his lake. When you recognize a free rider, what human beings do is they get angry. They get angry. And that's your mind, which was evolution has selected for you, because if you didn't, if you said, oh, I like free riders, you would be part of a society that couldn't solve its collective action problems. You would have been eliminated long ago by societies that could. But now so we can understand all this, you see, so now I can go back to where I was in the early history of morality. So what we have then is, we have the evolution of a psychology and a culture that's good at solving collective action problems for members of the in-group. The only way there's selection is if we're in competition with members of other groups, and there's no payoff to cooperating with members of other groups. And so that's why you get a certain kind of morality. You get a certain kind of morality. You start off with like exceptionless rules like thou shalt not kill and so on. And what happens is, once people start to think about it, they realize, well, a lot of the rules have exceptions. Like you say, well, thou shalt not kill, but then you say, well, what about in self-defense? Well, that's all right, you know. And so then people, they back up, and this is to me is a really important step in moral development, and you see it in every tradition, right? So I'm not favoring any tradition. People start to articulate a version of the golden rule. Now, the version of the golden rule is not going to be the final principle of morality, but it captures something really important, particularly once you understand collective action problems, because it says, okay, I should be willing to cooperate if others are willing to cooperate with me. And that's the logic of getting a solution to a collective action problem. Okay? But notice that when you look at statements of the golden rule, they start off saying things like, love your neighbor as yourself, or love your brother as yourself. And why? Why are they saying that? Because from an evolutionary point of view, you only get a payoff if you're helping the other people who are members of your community, right? Now, at some point in this development, though, people start extending it beyond. All I want you to see is that's a really important development. That's a hugely important development. Because no longer do we have an evolutionary explanation of it. But now what we can just say is we can see that there's a ground that we can understand, which is their willingness to cooperate to solve collective action problems is something that we were born with. But now something has happened. It's gotten extended, at least potentially, beyond the members of our in-group. And that's a hugely important development. Okay. Now there are actually two main versions of the Golden Rule. I'm going to say them just to tell you which one I want to focus on. The one is love your neighbor as yourself, right? And actually, anybody here a utilitarian? See, okay. In almost any other audience, people would say, "What's that?" But I figured a lot of people here, if you don't worry about it, because I'm not going to talk about utilitarianism. But all I want you to do is to see, if you are utilitarian, then you can trace your morality back through love your neighbor as yourself, and you just extend it to everyone. if we could have a conversation, Brooke, you and I later, we can talk about utilitarianism has problems, but still, it's a really neat moral view. But I want to go in a little different direction. I want to go in a Kantian direction. And to go in the Kantian direction, I say, but the other one is, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And there are really a lot of variations on that. And that is an anticipation of Kant's universalizability principle. How many people here just know what Kant's universalizability principle is? Just so getting. Okay, so see, that's the largest percentage I would ever get in any audience. But even so, it's only 50%. So I'm going to tell you what it is. Here it is. Manuel Kant's universalizability principle. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become universal law. Now, Kant actually said, my principle is an improvement on the golden rule. I think that's a mistake. And why is it a mistake? It's a mistake because Kant, it was sort of like Kant said, I'm going to solve the problem of morality with one hand tied behind my back. I'm going to do it without considering the desirability of outcomes at all. And I'm sorry, Kant, if you're going to solve the problem of morality, you need both hands. But because his was a purely logical test that didn't consider desirability at all, he couldn't actually do it. And so, again, if you're interested, come up, we'll talk about Kantian principle and why it doesn't work as a moral principle. But it's a great idea. And before, remember when I was doing the collective action problems and I said cooperate and defect? It's actually, if you translate it into that language, which Kant can't do because it's actually a great rule. And it says if you're in a collective action problem, consider there you have two alternatives, cooperate and defect. Think about which one you would want everyone to do. Well, Brooke, remember, if everyone pays to have their order, we have that clear lake. If no one does, we have that. Of course, if you think about it that way, you say, I want to have the clear lake. And then the only other thing you say is, okay, if others are willing to cooperate, in other words, if they're, you should be too. You shouldn't be, Russ, you shouldn't be trying to free ride on their cooperation. Just see, the disapproval is just a feeling that we have about it. And this is just hypothetical. It's like his evil twin. Russ would never do that, okay? But his evil twin would. So it's his evil twin I'm talking about. Okay. And so you see, so what you have is then here, I go back to the collective action problem. You say, look, if you just say, act as though you have a choice between two alternatives, the one where everyone cooperates and one where everyone defects. It's a no-brainer. But Kant couldn't say that because he thought it was a purely logical test. But notice those numbers represent desirability. You can't do it without the numbers. Okay, well. But Kant was a smart guy and he had a lot of good ideas. And what I want to do is I want to talk about an idea that he said is a development from my universalizability principle. But it's not. But still it's an interesting idea. And it plays an important role in our understanding this whole development. And that is to think when we get to the question of a legal system, a political system, and laws, how in the world can they be justified? How can they be legitimate? And he suggested a hypothetical consent test. It's a mere idea of reason. In other words, we're not asking whether everyone would actually consent, because we know they have all this disagreement and conflicts. No, they're not going to agree. But we're asking hypothetically, and what are we asking? Well, here, I'm going to read what he says, because the idea is the consent test is a mere idea of reason obligating every lawmaker to frame his law so that they might have come from the united will of an entire people, and to regard any subject who would be a citizen as if he had joined in voting for such a will. It's all hypothetical. If a law is so framed that all the people could not possibly give it their consent, and you see he always does it in terms of could not possibly, and that's always going to be his Achilles heel, because what do you mean they couldn't? Of course they could. They could have all possibly agreed to anything. But anyway, there's a moral idea that we're going to develop. As, for example, a law granting the hereditary privilege of master status to a certain class of subjects. And here's what he's doing here is he's saying natural aristocracy, natural class divisions. He's saying, if you think about it from a hypothetical test, what you can see is, well, the people who are going to be the aristocrats, they would agree to it, but how in the world would the people who are going to be from birth at a disadvantage, could it be rational for them to agree with it? Okay, if they couldn't agree with it, the law is unjust. But if it is at all possible that a people might agree on it, then the people's duty is to look upon the law as just, even assuming that their present situation or the tenor of their present way of thinking were such that if consulted, they would probably refuse to agree. In other words, he's saying, what you actually agree to doesn't matter. What's important is hypothetical consent. Now, that's a really important idea, but unfortunately, what we don't have is a statement of what the actual test is. It's just could they agree, but under what circumstances? How? Well, before we look at the test some more, what I want you to see is, with that idea, Kant actually did some amazing things. First one, well, we've actually said, elimination of hereditary distinctions of class. And here's another quote from him. There can be no one member of the community, no fellow subject, who is innately privileged over another. And now we get to an important lesson in the history of moral development, talking about which is, these developments are hard won, and they're not self-evident, and people have blind. How can someone who says that then go on to argue for discrimination against women and racial discrimination? Why? Because it's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer. If you say we're going to eliminate all hereditary distinctions on the basis of class, the obvious question is, what about hereditary distinctions on the basis of race or sex? And yet that was too far for him. He couldn't actually get that far. But what we can see is this, and this is, we don't even know quite what the hypothetical consent test is. But if it's a hypothetical consent test that rules out hereditary distinctions based on class, it's going to rule out hereditary distinctions. So in other words, there's something really powerful about the test. Okay. What else did Kant do? His prediction of the democratic peace, this is in his book Perpetual Peace. How many people here have read Perpetual Peace? This is the only group where I can ask that question and somebody would raise their hand. That's why I had to ask it. Just for the fun. It's, okay, well, good. For the rest of you. In Perpetual Peace, 1795 is a time when there was only one democracy in Europe, in France, and it had devolved into the reign of terror. So if you had said, what's the future of democracy? It did not look very good at that time. And what did Kant predict? He predicted in the future there would be a world federation of representative democracies that would guarantee human rights that would not go to war with each other. Are you kidding me? I mean, talk about surprising, right? This is one of the most surprising predictions. And so a prediction of the social sciences, but what's absolutely crucial is this. And I'm going to Kant based it on this hypothetical consent test. Okay, well anyway, so what's happened? Well, since World War II, Europe, for the first time, has formed a federation of representative democracies that commit to guaranteeing human rights, and they have not gone to war with each other for 70 years. Are you kidding me? Do you know the history of Europe? The history of Europe is the history of warfare. You can't even find a time, going back to when it was Europe, when there wasn't a war going on somewhere. How did Kant make these predictions? Well, now we know he had a hypothetical consent test for legitimacy. But you see, moral judgments don't imply any predictions in the actual world, you see. They don't. So how did he do it? One simple addition to his hypothetical consent test. So far as I know, Kant was the first to argue that considerations of justice influence history. Kant thought that if a government would be unstable if it were not regarded as a just government by its citizens. That was a lesson he drew from the American and especially the French Revolution. So he used his hypothetical consent test to determine what justice required, and then he predicted other governments that don't satisfy that test will be unstable, so eventually one day they'll all be representative democracies. Are you kidding me? In 1795? And what we can see is this. He made these astounding predictions, but he himself had his own blind spots. If somebody, if we could take a time machine and go back to 1795, but we could just say, well, but wait a minute. Let's apply the hypothetical consent test can even make more surprising predictions than you recognize, because just ending discrimination against women and racial discrimination, that would be huge, right? We're still talking about slavery. Okay. But here's the thing. What was the test that he was applying? We don't know, because what he says about the test doesn't actually yield determinate predictions. So we had an idea, but we don't know what it was. So the hypothetical consent test that, as Kant formulated it, is not precise enough to yield any determinate results. We need an improved test. And what the improved test is going to do is it's going to help us to understand what kind of transitions we're watching right before our eyes. Well, we get some help, because in the 20th century, John Harsanyi first presents the idea of a certain kind of hypothetical agreement, and then John Rawls develops it, and when he develops it, he calls it the original position. So now I ask, how many people have heard of the original position? I'm good to see a majority of the class. How often do I get a majority of my group that's heard of the original position? Never happens. Okay, thank you. So here we are. And now what I want to do is I want to say, I think that their original position is an improvement, right? Definitely improvement, but I think it needs more improvement. So all I'm going to say is that what I want to do is I want to talk about a generalization of the Harsanyi-Rawls original position. So I'm going to tell you roughly about it, but just keep in mind, for example, in their version of it, it's a choice position in which you're choosing the principles of justice. But I don't think that one's very successful. So I want to propose a different kind of original position. It's one where you are deciding on the basic rights and the other, which John Rawls calls constitutional essentials, the really central parts of your political system. And then once you've got the central parts, that'll include some kind of democratic rule or something like that. And then you let the democratic rule run, and they pass laws and so on and things like that. So you don't do everything in the original position, but you set up the whole structure, okay? And the main idea of the original position is that you go behind a veil of ignorance. And the veil of ignorance is not total ignorance. It's only ignorance of all personally identifying information. So you have no idea of your race, sex, IQ, strength, family background, social class. Okay? And so now we can see it's obviously a hypothetical. It's such a hypothetical test that we really can't literally do it, right? Is there anybody here who can erase from your mind all identifying information? So, but here's the thing. We're just saying, let's see if it's useful to try. Okay? And so then the test is unanimous agreement in the generalized original position behind the veil of ignorance. And all I want to say is that I think that Rawls and Harsanyi put a number of different constraints on it that I would relax. And one of them is they assume a certain kind of strict kind of rationality on the part of the agents of the original position. I don't think you need to do that. I think you can say, okay, allow the people even to have their moral considerations or whatever. But here's what's crucial. In the original position, they can't appeal to their religious authorities. So if they're going to make moral arguments, the argument can't be of the form, my religious authority says P, therefore P. They have to reason with each other. See, I think that's a really valuable addition to the original position, is to allow people to take, but of course they don't know exactly what moral position they're going to have in the real world, but whatever moral considerations they think would apply to anyone, they're welcome to use them. Okay? Now, notice, this test is also a generalization of the second version of the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Because now what we're saying is, remember, that's like a two-person rule, and it runs into problems because you say, whose preference is mine or theirs? And there are all sorts of interesting counterexamples to it, however you answer it. But now what we're saying is, you have to decide, thinking that you could be anyone with any of the preferences in, say, your society. That's okay? And so it actually solves a lot of the problems that there are with the Golden Rule. And then I also want to say there are three kinds of original position. The first one, the domestic original position, is to set up a constitution for a single society. This is Rawls's original position. And for reasons, again, in the questions, if you want to talk about it, I think Rawls, because of certain constraints that he was operating under, when he came to write the Law of Peoples, a natural question would have been, why not have the basis for international law be everybody gets together in an international original position and works out the constitution of the structure of, and as I say, if you want to talk about it, Rawls couldn't give that answer. And so but I think we can. So I want to say, look, I want to propose the original position is not only useful for members of the same society, but it can be useful for, say, international grouping, where you see in the original position what we can say is, look, well, do we have special obligations? See, Rawls was concerned that you couldn't then justify special obligations to members of your own society, but that's not true. Behind the veil of ignorance, you can say, regardless of what society we're in, do we have special obligations to members of our society? Why can't you ask that question, and why can't the answer be yes? In the same way, for example, I'm quite sure in the domestic original position, suppose you're in the domestic original position, you don't know who you are, and the question comes up, do we have special obligations to our own children? Of course you can argue for that in the original position. You don't have to know who you are. You're just saying, If I have children, I have special obligations to them, and you can make arguments for it. So now we go to the international original position. We say, do we have special obligations to members of our own society? And similarly, yes, we can argue for them. Okay. But you see, I'm never one to be content with, just a level of universality that just includes the Earth. So I want to go to the highest level of universality. How about the intergalactic original position, right? Yeah, the intergalactic original position is, suppose we discover intelligent life on other planets. Then when we are thinking about how we should treat each other and so on, we go behind a veil of ignorance and we come up with a constitutional structure for the whole universe. See, that's universal. Right? Now you see where we're going. But in any case, what we have is a way of understanding. It comes out of a moral tradition where a crucial step is the golden rule, and we see how we have a way of making more precise the idea behind the golden rule and solving some problems for it. And it's really a pretty neat idea. And Kant's point, it actually captures something that is operating in human history. It's a model of something that's operating in human history to this extent. In the original position, you can't justify slavery in the original position. And even in 1795, Kant would assume that. You cannot justify. That's a hereditary distinction of class. It took, hundreds of years, right, to end slavery. But in the original position, it's a no-brainer. What does it model? Well, I think it models empathic understanding plus impartiality. Empathic understanding because you're making rules where you could be anyone, and whatever that group is down there, you've got to look. And by the way, that's a limitation of our application of it is, if we lack empathic capacities, we're not going to come up with very good answers in the original position. And that's why I think it's really important when we imagine the original position, we imagine not that I'm just sitting in a chair by myself, but that we're actually in conversation with lots of different kinds of people so they can help us to be able to empathize with things that we don't have own familiarity with, okay? But that's okay, that's perfect, that's exactly what we'd expect from a moral position. But the goal then is to combine that empathic understanding with a kind of impartiality where it's a tough one. We have to come up with rules that we want to say work for everyone, So it's not the case, and see, this is why we're not talking about utilitarianism now, but if we were doing utilitarianism, I would say, that the problem, one of the big problems which led Rawls away from utilitarianism is that, look, when you're doing it and you look at utilitarianism, you're in the original position and you say, I just want to maximize overall utility, And that's a great idea in the abstract, but it doesn't pay attention to the distribution at all, right? So suppose you've maximized overall utility, and it's just that there's one group that, is greatly disadvantaged, but their disadvantage greatly benefits everyone else, Wow, that could be the one with the maximum utility. And then you look at the poor people in that one group, and you say, this is what I say, they say, why is it that we have to live this life? And the answer is, look how happy the rest of us are. Okay. So that's why I'm pursuing this other direction here, because this is one where, when you're in the original position, you're looking at it from everyone's point of view, and you're not saying, if we just disadvantage this group over here, the rest of us will be really happy, because you're thinking, I might be in that group, right? No, I want to make sure they get represented too. Okay, now here's what I take Kant's conjecture to be. Ordinary human beings are capable of making the kinds of judgment modeled. They've never heard of the OP. I mean, it's only in this group I can say who's heard of the original position, and people raise their hand. They've never heard of it. But what I'm suggesting is the forces, the bottom-up pressures for changes that I'm talking about come from people's reasoning, thinking in ways that are modeled by the original position. And for this conjecture to be true, all that's necessary is ordinary human beings are capable of making the kinds of judgment that combine this empathic understanding with impartiality, and they will resist governments whose laws cannot be justified in that way. That's all that's necessary for it to actually be making difference in history. Okay? That's the conjecture. Okay, and now, you see, the thing is, once you understand the original position this way, most of the developments in human rights are no-brainers, right? I mean, it's not like, it may take hundreds or thousands of years for it to actually happen, But it wasn't as though you couldn't have, if you had known this, you could have said, well, if we're going to make moral progress, this is what's going to happen. And so I'm going to go down the list really quickly, just so you can see. Because there are more difficult, it's not like every question is, but still it's so amazing that, I actually have a paper in which someday I want to make like, a proposal to the NSF to fund this. You have, in the social sciences, you have all these people making predictions, and almost none of them come true. But you have Immanuel Kant making predictions. It hasn't completely come true yet, but it certainly is pretty. So I'm saying, why don't we actually run a test of it? Because, instead of just one philosopher sitting in his room and thinking about it, let's get together people from all over the world and see what they would actually agree to. Okay, well, I'll tell you when I get that funding. Okay, now, so we have right against genocide. Right against genocide is no brainer, even though from an evolutionary point of view, genocide can be a very efficient strategy for, improving the status of your group. Right against slavery. You remember we talked about all these. I'm going to go on. Right to subsistence. Protections of the rule of law. Right to freedom of speech and assembly. And finally, democratic rights. The list goes on. Okay, so it's really quite amazing now that we've actually identified certain forces in history, and we have a model of the forces that we could actually use to make predictions. Okay. I'm going to now come up a little more closer to the present, because not only can we have done it, back in the kind of time of Kant, let's take a look at what's been happening in the United States Supreme Court. And you see, I've been around long enough that I actually have seen all these changes, but even if you haven't, you'll be around long enough to see the changes that come after I'm gone. So don't worry, it's not like I'm finished. And what we've seen is the emergence of liberty rights against paternalism. And they've never been called that. Okay? They've never been called that. So what am I talking about when I say liberty rights against paternalism? Well, first of all, the right for married couples to practice contraception in the privacy of their own home. Griswold v. Connecticut, 1965. Right? Connecticut had made selling contraception illegal. Now, why is it called a right against paternalism? Well, paternalism is treating people like children. So a paternalistic law is one that says, we're passing this law for your own good, even though you disagree. If you agree the law is good for you, it's not paternalistic. And that's why solutions to collective action problems. Suppose we have a law that forbids dumping your garbage in the lake, you have to pay to have it all away. Well, if you think having a clear lake and having your garbage hauled away is better than having this, then the law is for your own good, but you agree it's for your own good. But in paternalistic laws, classic paternalistic laws, which would be like drug laws, right? The person who's being restrained, it's not solving a collective action problem, but it's just, we don't think this is good for you, and obviously, if the person agreed, they wouldn't be doing the action that's made it, you wouldn't have to make it illegal. Okay? So practicing contraception, that was the first one. At the time, does anybody remember what kind of right was this identified as by the Supreme Court when they passed this? Just a second, Brooke, I'll call on you if nobody else raises their hand.
Property right?
Property right?
Property right?
Well, that's sort of an interesting idea, but no, you see at least, because you're thinking like in the Fifth Amendment, at least there says, no deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So at least there would be something in the Constitution. I will give you a hint. It's not in the Constitution. Privacy, right? What did they call it? What kind of right was it? It wasn't in the Constitution, so what did they call it? Anybody know?
Penumbra.
Penumbra. What's a penumbra?
It's the sort of shadow at the edge of a shadow.
Yeah, there's the shadow. The shadow represents what's in the Constitution, and it's in that little fuzzy area around the shadow, right? It's sort of, somewhere. Have you ever heard of a constitutional interpretation which says it's not in the Constitution, but it's close enough, we'll put it in? But this is the way this process works. You see, that you might have thought this process, well, it happened a long time ago. It happens in ways that are really surprising. But it was called a right to privacy. Okay, so then you get, actually, Loving versus Virginia. How many people saw the movie about Loving versus Virginia? Highly good movie, right? Okay. And that was declaring prohibitions on mixed-race marriage unconstitutional, right? That was presented, see again, it's not in the Constitution, folks, but it was presented as being unconstitutional because it was racially discriminatory. But the Attorney General of Virginia actually made a very persuasive argument that it was not racially discriminatory. If I know what the argument was, it discriminates equally against whites and blacks. Do you see? It not only presents black people over marrying white people, it presents white people over marrying black people. What's discriminatory about that? But see, these people are smart. And so, but they said, no, it's discrimination. I said, I know discrimination when I see it. So, okay, that's fine. But actually read the decision. And the decision fits into this tradition. It's the importance of certain decisions that people should be free to make. That's rights against paternalism, people. Okay. But at least they couldn't say it, right? Okay. Then we have refusal of life-sustaining treatment, Cruzan v. Director. And for the first time, this is a penumbral right to privacy. And you couldn't think it was a right to privacy. Why not? Because when you're refusing life-sustaining equipment, you're in a hospital dealing with strangers. It has nothing to do with privacy at all. You're out there as public as you can get. But it is that you have certain decisions that you have a right to make, and the government does not have a right to prohibit you from making those choices, no matter how bad they think the choices are. So eventually, we knew they were going to stop calling it right to privacy. And indeed, they stopped calling it in Planned Parenthood v. Casey. They said it's a liberty right. And then in Lawrence v. Texas, which was overruling sodomy statutes, they said it's clearly a liberty right. And you see, remember the person back there who said property? Liberty, that's in the Constitution. In the Fifth Amendment, it says, no deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. But how could that apply? There was no allegation anywhere that there had not been due process of law. They passed the law according to legitimate democratic procedures. How could it be covered by the Fifth? And the answer is, the only thing is, the word liberty appears there, so it's better than privacy, because privacy didn't appear anywhere, right? But what we can see is, something has happened in constitutional interpretation. It wasn't there, and now it's there. And if we ask, just a second, I'll take your question. Something has happened, and if we say, what's happened? And somebody says, oh, well, yeah, it's just the judges, they just decide whatever they want or something like that. What's actually fascinating about it is we have an alternative explanation. The alternative explanation is, what would we predict on the basis of the original position, because this is constitutional law, And what's interesting is, although almost everybody in the United States who has a religious authority, their religious authority, say, until recently, opposes same-sex marriage. Put yourself in the original position and ask yourself, the original position, and see, this is autobiographical now, because I've been teaching philosophy of human rights. I started in 1995. In 1996, I can still see her. There was a young woman who was a lesbian who didn't like sitting in the seats, so she often sat over in the window. And we're doing the original position. We do the original position, and people are making all sorts of proposals. And she says, I propose a right to same-sex marriage. Now, I want to tell you, it's not true, but I want to tell you, well, of course, you see, I thought through all the implications of the original position, and I realized that's I was floored. Never occurred to me. See, that's like, so I don't, when I say, well, Kant, I had a blind spot, it's not like, oh yeah, but fortunately I don't have any. No. But here's what happened for those of us in the class, including me. We considered it. Now, a lot of the people in the class had moral authorities that said no same-sex marriage. But of course, in the original position, they didn't know who their moral authorities were, so we just had to consider it. By the end of the class, they'd agreed to a right to same-sex marriage. May I remind you that in 1996, this was before the big fear of same-sex marriage led to all these different states adopting constitutional amendments to ban it, which was in 2004, right? This is in 1996. It was not even on the radar. There were people who were thinking about it, obviously. My student over there was. But we had a long way to go before the United States was going to go from banning it. But if you had done that, if you'd been in my class, you would have agreed to it too. Are you kidding me? Now, somebody had a question.
I'll hold it to the end.
Oh, okay. There is no right against paternalism in the U.S. Constitution. But all of these rights would easily pass. They're easily, in other words, they're hard ones too. But these all, I mean, you just imagine, you're in the original, suppose you're in the original position and there's no one there to represent gays. That would never occur to you, of course. But as soon as it does, then you're in the situation, suppose you're saying, yeah, but we should reserve marriage for homosexuals. But you go, oh, wait a minute. If I were gay or lesbian, right, wouldn't I want to also have, I'm not required. It would be different if we were saying we require everyone to get married, including gays or lesbians. Oh, no. It's just a right to be able to do it. It's a no-brainer. And so you see, I want to give you this so you get an appreciation for how amazing this process is. How amazing it is that it's one that's been going on for hundreds of years, and it's still going on. Obergefell v. Hodges was 2015. I mean, I can actually talk about another one which will come back to the Supreme Court, will be a right to assisted suicide. Okay. Conclusion before I have my afterthoughts. The generalized original position models motivations that have transformed human history. Motivations that explain why, quote, to quote Martin Luther King Jr., the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. If that's true, that's what's happening. But the thing is, when everybody says something like that, the message is sort of, oh, let's just sit back and watch. Give me some popcorn. The greatest show on earth. Let's sit back here. I'm going to sit over here, get my popcorn. I just want to watch all this thing as it transpires before my eyes. What a great entertainment. And all the people, I want to join all the other around the universe are watching the show. I want to fly out there and watch the show. It doesn't happen that way. It only happens. It's not like it's some inevitable historical. It only happens if enough people are capable of the empathic understanding plus impartiality that are modeled in the OP and are willing to incur at least small costs, and some of them are going to have to incur large costs, right? But at least they have to be willing to incur small costs, promote laws that would be agreed on the OP. And that means it's the greatest show on earth, but it's only a show for the people on those other planets. For us, it is a day-to-day project and vocation. And whatever we do, we know all we can do is push it a little bit forward and hope that the succeeding generations will keep it going, because it won't keep going by itself. See, Russ told you I try to give you an optimistic. Okay, well. Now we end with a little pessimism too. Postscript on the original position in the current political climate. The original position, a model of change motivated by empathy plus impartiality, but when a group feels threatened, empathy is blocked and tribal solidarity is triggered. And for those of you who, recognize the historical precedents, the last time this happened was in the 1930s, and now it's happening again. I mean, it's always happened in different parts of the world, but I'm talking about on a global scale. Tribal solidarity can easily lead to extreme violence, including genocide. And there isn't, the slogans for opposing genocide, as they always say, never again. I say, you wish. You wish. In the current political climate, in the short term, we depend on there being enough people capable of and motivated by empathic understanding and impartiality to protect human rights. And it's a tough, it means, for example, suppose that the Las Vegas shootings had been done by a Muslim. I am very confident that there would have then been a Muslim registry, which could have been the preliminary for actually, concentration camps, right? So that means when there's a Muslim registry, my name's on it. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about people who are willing to say, I'm not going to let you demonize this group and treat them as the enemy with no rights. Now, I don't know whether you'll sign that registry, but what I think is that it's really important for each of us to think, what can we do to prevent that from happening? And what we're seeing is, it's a test. It's actually a test for the power of these ideas. And here's my optimism. Suppose we fail the test. Well, unless we wipe out the whole universe, all the human beings, future generations, I think, will pick it up. So it's not hopeless. But it could be a great loss of all sorts of really valuable and important things. And in the long term, what are the prospects for human rights depend on whether the past developments that we've made can be preserved, or whether they're rolled back and we sort of have to go back and start over again. That's about as optimistic as I can be. Thank you. Now, when I turn this off, then I have to be here because that's going to be. So here we go. There's a.
You can go to your first page again.
Oh, here we go. Watch this. Here we go. Blank. Okay, now, do you take a break now, or do you just go right to questions? Go right to questions?
I have a question.
You have a question? I think we're going right to questions. Yes, what's your question?
So, isn't there a tension? You talked about the right to religious freedom, and then but a lot of the stuff that you mentioned, when you talked about the original position, ruling out issues of legal moralism, some of those could be construed as, legal paternalism. Some of those could be construed as legal moralism, which is connected with religion in an interesting way.
It is, that's right.
So, there's a little tension there. How do you...
There would only be a tension there if the right to religious freedom was
Right.
the right to legislate your religious views. But it's
Right.
not. So in other words, I can see what you would say, well, but wait a minute, you're telling me I have religious freedom to practice my own religion, but you're telling me I don't have the right to impose my religious views on others? Answer, yeah, that's what a right
So
to
that's
religious
where the
freedom.
paternalism comes in, is the right to, the supposition that you have a right to impose your views on others.
What's the classic example?
So some of what I'm calling legal moralism might be folded into legal paternalism on your view.
That's right. As a matter of fact, it's going to be, for example, take, for example, the Western European colonization of the Americas, where Bartolomé de las Casas tells us how when the Spaniards arrived, they read the requerimento to the natives. Before we say what, does anybody know what language they read the requerimento in? Latin, yeah. Sometimes Spanish. Okay, but anyway, so setting that aside, the requerimento says, we're here representing the King and Queen of Spain, who themselves have been appointed by the Pope, who has authority over the universe. Actually, what it's I believe in universal moral. There it is, over the universe. And we've been ordered to convert you to Christianity, and if you don't convert, and by the way, even if you do, we're probably going to, we're going to beat the crap out of you. Yeah. So that's the opposite of religious freedom, but it certainly is true that they had religious authorities who commanded them to do that. So what I'm saying is the original position shows us how, even in a tradition that has religious authorities like that, if they are capable of entering into the original position, and they're able to say, well, I could look down, I could be a Christian, or I could be a native, then they would recognize, and this is a really interesting example. The Christians should be free to practice their religion, but there are limits on their practice. And one of them is they can't coerce other people. And it's really a no-brainer in the original position. But you couldn't get there if in the original position people knew their religious authorities, because then they have to say, what does my religious authority say? And of course we know what the religion... And that's why it's surprising, but it actually worked for same-sex marriage, even though... I've done same-sex marriage, with groups where some of the women are wearing burqas. Right? I know their religious authorities do not approve of same-sex marriage. But we have the discussion, and so on, and they end up voting for it. And that's why it's also interesting to see the original position is not just, you just go and ratify your own moral views. That's not true. Because people who, when they walk out of the room, out of the original position, are going to have religious authorities that oppose same-sex marriage. still here they can listen to the reasons and they can see why they would agree in that context. So it's really a powerful idea. It doesn't just it doesn't just reinforce whatever views you came in with. Now it can, because it depends on empathy and impartiality. If you're not capable of that, yeah, it'll just reinforce your views. Like, for example, if we had, if we took a time machine and we went back to antebellum South and found a slave owner, and said, we have a test for you. We would like you to go behind the veil of ignorance and see then if you would agree to allowing slavery. I guarantee you they would. They would come up with reasons for it. But that doesn't show that there's a problem with the original position, because it's a no-brainer. If you actually are capable of the original, all you'd have to say to them, if they were really capable of it, you would say, you realize, of course, if you turn out to be a slave, your children will be taken away from you and sold. No human being who took that seriously would agree. You wouldn't even have to go into the rest of how awful slavery is. No human being who was capable of empathy would agree to that. They'd say, look, there must be a better system. There must be a better system. Now, you had your hand up before. Do you still have a question?
Well, yes, I do, because, I thought it was interesting when you were talking about the Supreme Court cases and how we're pushing against paternalism. And I think that we should look at that, though, with a caveat. It depends on what group you're looking at, right? So post-Planned Parenthood versus Casey, when it opened up states to push forward legislation limiting abortion rights of women, we've seen over 700 pieces of legislation come out post-1996 in an effort to control a woman's right to have an abortion.
Yeah,
so,
one of the reasons I didn't include Planned Parenthood v. Casey on the list is because it had to do with abortion. And abortion is one that was actually put under the rubric of the right to privacy, but it's not, strictly speaking, a right against paternalism. So it's a much more complicated case.
Yeah, because I know they utilized right to privacy in Roe versus Wade.
Yes, they did. That's right. But that's not. You see, why is that not? Why are abortion prohibitions not paternalistic? Now, when you think about it from the point of view of the woman, you're saying, well, we're doing this for your good. That would make it paternalistic. But the crucial issue in abortion is whether or not the fetus is a person.
Yes.
And that, there's a disagreement. The original position cannot solve that for us, because the original position, we have to assume that all the persons are represented. But it doesn't tell us who the persons are. If the fetuses are in the original position, no one is going to allow abortion. If they're not, then you're going to get abortion. But the original position can't settle the question of whether they're in there.
But they're being couched for the woman's good, at least in Texas, with the latest legislation that was just struck down by the Supreme Court. I think it was H8 or something HT, something like that, House Bill 2.
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact name, but this just happened a bit ago. The argument was that this is for the woman's protection, for the woman's health, and yet...
Yeah,
that's BS.
And here's the thing, what can I say?
But I grant that...
When you look at the arguments that are actually given, that's why it's... And by the way, does anybody think what I was saying here is, this is the only force in history and everything is moving? No, it's not the only force. But all I was saying was, when you get to abortion as a constitutional issue, it no longer is cleanly an issue of paternalism, so it's not covered by this kind of... And it's a much harder issue to address, just for that reason.
I grant that.
Yeah, and so what's fascinating to me is that we can actually use the original position in this case to say why it's not an easy one, right? The other ones are really no-brainers in a lot of ways. This is not. And so we would expect then it would be a more difficult issue, and I think it is. Yes, in the back.
So you presented the sort of multi-step generalization process from our
The domestic original position to the international to the...
tracing it back to evolutionary history. Right?
Oh, okay, yeah, the whole history of moral... How many times have you done the whole history of moral development?
Right, and you go through the Golden Rule, and then Kant, and then Rawls, right?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, do you? So there's this sort of sophomoric philosophical question that one could ask, right? Why use the original position as a approach for settling moral or political disputes? And I'm wondering to what extent you think the answer to that has to do with ultimately the dispositions we have to resent free riders that we have by virtue of our evolutionary origins during the Pleistocene hunter-gatherer phase.
Now, I think that's what started it. And I think it takes on its own independent development once we go beyond members of the in-group. But if you still say, our collective action problem is still a problem, yes, but there's more than that. You see, the thing is, the original position thought experiment is not limited to solving collective action problems.
Right, but I'm just asking you, do you
Yeah.
think our recognition of its authority has anything to do with that? With the,
I think, so let me, I'll say something and you see what you,
Okay.
if it makes sense. I think that our ability for moral judgment at all depends on that evolutionary history. But that some people try to reduce our ability of moral judgment back to whatever evolution favors, something like that, and I think that's a big mistake. But, so in other words, there are still remnants of it there, but we've gone beyond it, and I think we went beyond it. I tried to, when, first of all, people articulate versions of the golden rule that are limited to the in-group, and then somebody starts extending them beyond. That's historically the point at which we now can see that we've gone beyond it. Now, we may have already gone beyond it before then, but then it's quite clear. And then from there, it goes on even further, so that whatever started it all out, as I'm saying, avoiding free riding and collective action problems, becomes sort of part of the historical story of how we got here. But it didn't determine it. In other words, it's not like this. There's nothing else except, whatever. Suppose we'd had a different starting point, we could have come with a totally different morality, and neither one of them is, better than the other. They're just the results. I think that's a mistake. I think that actually what we developed is a certain kind of capacity that allows us to reflect on where we are, and then to make judgments about what we have to have something that started off that judgment, but now, that's why I do it as a developmental process. We've gone beyond whatever we started off with. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
I have so you threw up a slide about right to religion and a number of rights that we.
And then I added more later,
Yeah,
right?
and
even then I say, and the list goes on,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
So I'm thinking about history. Like there's been cultures throughout history that have had those rights. The Mongols, for example, have tolerance of religion and so forth, right? So I'm wondering, why is it that more of these rights are taking place now? And so my question is there something about media, the fact that that helps us cultivate empathy? The fact that I'm thinking of like Ellen DeGeneres' show and its role in same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
The fact that we can see people that are different than us, is that perhaps priming us for doing better in the original position?
I want to just build on that idea, yeah. Lynn Hunt has a book called The Invention of Human Rights. I won't ask how many have read that, but and when she tells the story of the development of human rights, usually it's the story of the Enlightenment, and they use their pure reason, to see self-evident truths. And what she says is, no, it's the development of empathy, and what you see is the development of the epistolary novel, and the epistolary novel is people from different positions, like, say, for example, an unwed mother, writing their story, and people who would never in a million years have empathized with an unwed mother now are empathizing with an unwed mother, and so on. So what you have is, so I'd say the novel, the development of the novel, which happens at the same time in the 18th century, that's a huge development. And so now you say, okay, the novel, well, that's sort of old technology, and now are there other things too? Oh yeah, look, I remember the Vietnam War. Why was there? It was so hard to prosecute the Vietnam War. Every night on TV, they showed video of what was happening to these people. Before, you could have a war and nobody actually saw what was happening. Yeah, I think it's hugely important. And so when I think of it as, there's an unfortunate tendency to think, well, if it involves empathy, then it's not a rational process. And that's due to Hume's influence, because Hume is the one who said, well, reason can only do this very narrow thing, and everything else is doing like that. But if you have an expansive conception of reason, then it's actually a way in which we can understand reason operates other than by doing 2 + 2 = 4, right? Which is such a reductivist, minimalist conception of reason. Yes. Now, there are a lot of hands, so sometimes when I'm pointing, it'll be indeterminate, but yeah, right now, and then I'll do the person in front of you. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk.
Yeah.
And I've got a comment and then a question. One thing I did like about the talk, so I'm more of a philosopher of biology, don't know as much about human rights, and I just sat there and I was trying to sort through some of the evolutionary claims, but you answered the other gentleman's question about that. And then I started thinking, well, what about invaders and these groups, invaders of selfishness? And I think that you kind of suggested one particular defense that perhaps might be there, and that's something like the original position as a mechanism for empathy and impartiality. And I think there's something that I really like about that. But then there's this other worry I have. You talk about confederation. We have the domestic original position, then we have the other. I forgot your
international and then intergalactic, right?
And we
if there's a larger category, I want to put that one in too. Yeah.
But we already have that international original position in some ways. That's called the United States of America because we're a confederation, if you will, a union of 50 democracies. And what if this impartiality? This pressure from impartiality and sort of, in some regards, empathy, and sort of this push away from paternalism and more toward autonomy, allows certain states, like Samantha was suggesting earlier, certain states that would actually pursue their own interest in particular ways, and maybe in odious ways that would actually, it's like, oh, the federal government shouldn't be getting into the middle of states' rights. I should be allowed to do certain things. And it seems like if we're a group of states, it seems the group of states, if they can decide this way, and I'm not sure how that would work, if they could decide that way, they may actually prefer a case where this overarching organization doesn't actually push their sense of justice on them, sort of like a political neutrality at that level. So I'm wondering if in your view, there might be a pressure that's kind of pushing toward tribalism as we sort of get sorting into, I don't want to move to Texas. I want to stay right here in Washington, right? Because that's where my tribe is. I don't want to go anywhere near Texas. I don't want to go near Mississippi. I don't want to go, the red states.
So you're right next to one, buddy.
Yeah, I know. That's the reason I don't live there.
But so far, you said it gets odious, and when I'm thinking it gets odious, that they're actually doing something harmful to others. And when they're doing that, that's not a paternalistic law that prevents that. So I'm thinking that there will be, and this was Kant's idea, there will be some kind of framework for adjudicating harm coming from one state to another, right? And that seems, again, like a no-brainer in the original position. So why would they be odious? It might be odious in this way. You disapprove of what they're doing. Yeah, they're Republicans, They go around maybe carrying guns all the time. You disapprove of that. But that's not, to me, a moral problem, that they're allowed to do it even though you disapprove of it, right? And they disapprove of you, in something like that. To me, that's really a benefit of the original position, is it explains how it is that both sides could be justified in doing that thing, as long as they're going around with guns they're shooting across the border at you or something like that. Does that make sense? In other words, you are seeing the structure of the view, but I think you're not appreciating that there's really a lot of content coming out of the original position. And the content is that when you say odious, that's ambiguous between they're doing things that are harmful to others or just things that others disapprove of. And you're not going to get a right to stop them from doing things that you disapprove of, but you're easily going to get a right. And here, so for example, let's take it, see, in other words, whenever it gets too abstract, one thing about me, I say bottom up, I go down to the ground level. So here's, what's a kind of example that I'm talking about? Climate change. Climate change, this is actually like a super collective action problem, right? And it has all sorts of different other facets, right? And what we can see is that who knows what humans are going to actually do? But in the international original position, it would be a no-brainer. In the international original position, people wouldn't be arguing. You know what they argue now? Oh, their limits aren't as severe as ours, so we're not going to accept limits. And that's total BS. In the original position, what you'd say is, we have to find a framework within which, and we would in the original position, it would be so easy to find a framework within which we just say, okay, it's a fair way of allocating the cost. Because I wouldn't know that I was from the United States and we were one of the big polluters, and so I would say, yeah, the people who have produced more of the pollution, they are going to pay more of the cost, but they're actually wealthier, so it's actually a lesson. It's so easy. See, that's the thing. Once you get the idea of the original position, all these really, really difficult, it's not every difficult question, but some of them become easy. And that's actually a really interesting, that means it may take hundreds of years, and with climate change we don't have hundreds of years, but the prediction would be eventually, okay, they'll figure it out, but it's very hard because we can't actually do it in the original position. Yes, you got another question because
Well, it's just
something
just
I've
a
said is triggered.
Just a clarification question. So
Yeah.
you seem to be making two arguments then. A empirical claim concerning the historical development of morality, and a moral or ethical claim concerning how we should become Rawlsians.
Or just how we should treat each other.
Yes.
And what's interesting is that I could have given a lecture on either one or the other, but I take Kant as raising the absolutely amazing, totally amazing idea that there's a connection between the two. And so now I say, okay, once we see it, we have to go to the moral level to figure out the judgments at the moral level, and then we say, interestingly enough, this is not totally disconnected from the world. Will it happen in my lifetime? Well, with climate change, I hope it will happen in my lifetime. Because we don't have, it took, hundreds of years. These other developments take hundreds of years. We don't have hundreds of years now. But I think that urgency will actually accelerate the process. But it's really hard, isn't it? It's really hard because in the real world, coal producers and oil producers know who they are, and they're thinking, I'm going to get as much profit out of my coal and oil as I can. And if I could get them to go to the original position and actually do it, they would say, we can't take that coal and oil out of the earth. We've got to leave it in the earth. But I'm sorry. There's a limit to what I can do. That means it takes a longer time because it's going to be bottom up. It's not going to be the coal producers and the oil producers who do it. It's got to come bottom up, and it's got to come from people being able to make these judgments, and then they change the world. But the interesting thing is, now with climate change, that's a tough one. See, Russ says I'm an optimist, and I am an optimist. And so here, I'm going to make an optimistic prediction, and you'll get to see whether it's true. Bad news about climate change. The effects are happening, right? You look at these tropical storms, one right after the other, Well, but wait a minute, that's the good news too. Because the good news is people won't take it seriously until they actually see the effects of it. So, my prediction is things are going to happen. Things are going to change. Even though right now we're at a total impasse. Right? So now you come and check with me in 30 years. Because I say 30 years. If it hasn't changed in 30 years, kiss your ass goodbye. No. But we're in deep doo-doo.
We're supposed to run out of clean drinking water by 2040.
Well, okay. Just I do not want to hear any more bad news. But in any case, that's it. If you actually think about it this way, you see people, once they recognize this is a really important problem, they'll solve it. Now, it's not inevitable. Look, the continuation of human life on this planet is not inevitable. We're more and more aware of that these days, right? But still, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to make a prediction. Yes?
I'm worried that your view is subject to the same kinds of criticisms from non-ideal theory that Rawls and Rawlsians are subject to. So, to give an example, so Rawls is working with an ideal theory where everything, there's no oppression, there's everyone agrees to the principles of justice. There are all these caveats. It's not like the real society that we have. So I'm worried that applying this kind of original position to our actual society will actually be unjust in some scenarios. So, for example, in an ideal society, we might all agree to, and I think we would, that we shouldn't have discrimination. There should be no discrimination by, let's say, by race.
There's certain kinds of, yes, that's right, sure.
There should be no racial discrimination. But I actually think that given our current society and our history of racism, that we need racial discrimination kind of in the opposite direction as a measure of corrective justice.
Yeah.
So we need some sort of, reparations, or we need affirmative action, or we need these things to correct for past injustices. So how...
Thank you for that question. That's a great question. I didn't even pay you to ask that question. But remember I said it's a generalized original position? I think Rawls' original position is way too idealized. He assumes full compliance. Mm-hmm. But I think in the original position, you see, in this generalized original position, what we do is we're quite realistic. When we consider a proposal, we have to say, well, what do we expect the compliance to be? And if we think the compliance is not going to be very good, I don't care how ideal it is, we're not going to agree to it in the original position. And see, Rawls, for example, then has no theory of punishment because he doesn't need one. In the original position, we assume full compliance, but I need a theory of punishment because and so then when we get down to, the kinds of questions like, I mean, really, it's just, I'm saying, go to your original position and ask yourself, suppose you're a member of a group that's been enslaved and discriminated. I mean, it's really the history. First of all, we have to spend some time in the original position because you may not know all the history, right? Like, I didn't know. When in the New Deal, when they passed the first minimum wage laws, they excluded agricultural workers. I thought, they must be discriminating against Latinos, right? Because that's who's doing that. In Washington, that's who's doing agricultural work. No, it was to prevent blacks in the South from being covered by the minimum wage. I mean, you go through the whole history. And then you say in the original position, I have a suggestion. We just wipe the slate clean and start from the beginning and pretend like none of that happened. Do you think there's going to be agreement to that original position? No, because as the original position, I'm going to say, look, if I'm a member of the group that's suffered all this discrimination, we have got to have some kind of correction. See, it actually works. But it's only that you're right. That's why I'm departing in many ways, if you want to talk about many ways, from Rawls's idealized assumptions for just the reason, see, you're exactly right, for just the reasons that you said. All I want to do is to show you the original position has a value beyond the way Rawls and Harsanyi both use. By the way, for those, Harsanyi, when he did the original position, he ended up with utilitarianism. That's why it's so neat. You have Rawls ending up with principles. And I say, I don't even see how you get the principles of justice out of the original position, but I can certainly get some, constitutional rights and human rights and so on. That's really interesting. Thanks for that question. Now, you've had your hand up for a while, sorry.
I wanted to ask about, Samantha pointed out that you agreed to the talk having a normative component and what we call an empirical component.
Yeah.
What's the status of the generalized original position in the empirical side of things for your picture? So I can think it's not something that, say, Supreme Court justices reasoned explicitly in terms of, right? You're not claiming that. So is it implicit in the concept of right and what we've been seeing as the history of the Supreme Court, say, is to take your example, has developed over time, is that what rights really were, at the outset, were not interpreted properly by Kant because he had blind spots to his racism and sexism and so forth. But in the concept of right was what has unfolded. Is that in the vicinity of what you're thinking? Is it something that...
Well, I have a little more radical view than that.
Okay.
In other words, I think that there can be, if you go back in time, I mean, here's my simple example. By definition, when I learned what a whale was, I learned a whale is a fish. Okay? Mm-hmm. So if you said, was it implicit in the concept of a whale that it's a mammal? No, it was not implicit in the concept at all. But on the other hand, I'd say it was inevitable in a way that if there was a certain kind of inquiry, we were going to discover whales are mammals. So I want to say what it's modeling is a certain way of thinking. It's not that there's a concept that carries it all in. What in the world would that concept be? The concepts are themselves subject to development over time.
So what is the way of thinking?
The way of thinking is, ultimately, it's what I say is it's the moral point of view. The moral point of view. And now we can say we model we model a certain kind of empathy plus impartiality. And you can even say for each one of them, you can say what's empathy and what's impartiality, and that opens up more questions. And you can't tell by looking at our presuppositions right now what empathy and impartiality are, because I want to say that's our best effort to understand it, and they can evolve over time too. And so it's a process of development where it's not at any particular time that you can say, oh, now we're just working out the implications of what is. No, it's actually a much more interesting process than that. Now, it's a really deep question, and when I'm actually doing a workshop on Saturday too, and I'll actually come back to this question then, and if you want to talk about it afterwards too. But it's a big question, so. Yes?
Coming back to religion and right to religious freedom.
Yeah.
So there's this historical narrative about right to religious freedom, which might be inaccurate, but I was wondering how it fits with what you said. So
okay.
The idea is that there was 17th century, there was the 30 years war, right, between...
Oh, there was... The wars of religion, by the way, were some of the most lethal wars in history, right?
So between Catholics and Protestants,
yeah.
And after that, basically, that was the time where, in a way, the right to religious freedom was introduced, in a way, in some, at least preliminary form. Idea being that, well, the conflict was so violent that the...
Yeah, it was only like a last resort. It was like when each side says, well, we can't kill all the others, then somebody says, well, maybe we should tolerate. But it takes a long time, right? And it's only, if you say, how does it actually happen? It only happens that there are certain lucky places like Amsterdam where they have terrible fighting, but somebody has the idea, well, let's be tolerant. And what they see is a great flowering. Amsterdam becomes, it's hard to imagine how influential Amsterdam was, in the 17th century. And a lot of the attraction was, and this is like, Richard Florida's work about basically the advantage of tolerant cities, right? Just having tolerant cities actually opens up all sorts of creativity and so on. So Amsterdam was the first example we can see in the Western tradition. But in any case, there's an explanation for why. But here, if you say, yeah, what was it? It was they tried as hard as they could to exterminate their opponents, and they couldn't do it, so then they had to go to Plan B.
So I guess my question is, like, when this right to religious freedom was introduced then by the powers that were back then, it seems as if it was this kind of top-down process in a way.
Top-down? Are you kidding me?
It was effective due to the fact that these various monarchies came together
Oh,
and decided,
well,
well, actually we should allow religious freedom, at least when it comes to particular states.
Oh, yeah, but where did the work...
Like
here philosophers get a lot of credit. Where did the work get done before that, before they finally came, and you have philosophers and lots of other people, they weren't philosophers too, who were laying the seeds for somebody to be able to... Because it was a hard thing to consider, right? Because the thought was this: these people are going to hell, and their religion represents putting people at risk of going to hell. It took a lot of groundwork before that idea could actually be overcome. And even the Pope was angry when you have, the idea that, oh no, we're going to have... Anybody know what year did the Catholic Church officially adopt religious tolerance as its policy? And by the way, I'll tell you, before they adopted it, you know what their policy was? Religious establishment in countries in which we're the majority religion, and religious tolerance in countries in which we're the minority religion. Does everybody, everybody here, that's free riding? Does everybody hear that? It's not willing to cooperate? You see, so in other words, but still, for hundreds of years, does anybody know when they officially gave up that doctrine in favor of what's obvious, willing to cooperate on fair terms, which is, I'll tolerate you if you tolerate me, and said that applies even where we're the majority. I wouldn't expect anybody to do it.
Would it have been Vatican II?
It was Vatican II, 1966. That's how recent it was. So in other words, if you're saying, is it top down, there's the religious authorities getting the word in 1966.
We should have one more question.
Okay.
Oh yeah, Brooke's been waiting. So no.
So I guess I just think about the shooting that happened and the reaction from NRA members and Republicans. And I think about the original position, and when I'm in the original position, I guess, if I'm understanding it correctly, is I would think that not necessarily banning guns, but putting some sort of restriction on that would be, empathic because of the people that have been hurt because of it. But then I would assume that an argument would be made that regulations like that would be considered paternalistic.
No, it's not paternalistic because it's to prevent, if you could say it's to prevent the gun owners from shooting themselves. But if it's to prevent them from shooting other people, it's not paternalistic, you see? It's harm to others. But in the original position, this is a tough case because you have arguments on both sides. One is the harm that's done by guns. The other is a right of self-defense. And you see, and you have a division in this country, and Russ and I were talking about it earlier, because Part of the country lives in cities where the great danger is people having guns and shooting other people. Part of the country lives in places where, to be able to defend themselves, they don't have, the police are not nearby. And they really need to be able to defend themselves, right? And then you also have hunting and things like that, too. And so that means, but in the original position, there would be some kind of reasonable compromise. We do not live in the original position, people. There is no reasonable compromise here. But it's not a no-brainer in that, I can tell you exactly what it would be. I think it would be very interesting. I would love to do it. When I get my NSF funding, we'll get together people and find out if we can find a compromise. Because to do it, we'd have to have people who both on each side, see the importance of owning guns for people, and also but they have to be able to look at it from the other point of view, right? They have to, if they could do that, my bet is they would come up with a reasonable compromise, and then we could ask, will it ever happen in the real world? I can't say to you everything that would agree in the original vision, it'll happen in the real world. I'm not even that much of a Pollyanna. But if we found that there were an agreement, I think that would be a great thing to actually organize around when you're going, as opposed to, right now, what people organize around is the people who support gun control, they make their proposal, knowing that the people on the other side couldn't agree to it, and the people on the other side make their proposal, and, if you support gun control, you just happen to be in the same unfortunate situation as I am in, which is the NRA has more political power, but neither one of them is making a compromise that will work for both. But in the original position, they would. I'd be fascinated to see what they see. Will you support my NSF grant when I apply to get funding so we could find out? It would actually be really interesting.
Well, let's give Professor Talbott.